Hello everyone, my name is Jalen Stevens and I'll be your tour guide today as you explore Arkansas. Today I'm going to be telling you a little story and a little history about something that happened in Arkansas in 1927, and it was the flood of 1927, and it was actually the most destructive and costly flood in Arkansas and one of the worst in history of the nation. So we're going to be looking at the history of the flood and how it all came to be, and then we're going to look at how it affected Arkansas and some of the states surrounding it, and we're just going to talk about some of the racial and socio-economical effects that it had. So I want to start by looking at the history of the flood of 1927 in Arkansas. This flood was not only made by nature, but there was also a lot of man-made input that it had that made the devastation so big. In the 1920s, technology started to advance, and that came with the growing economy, and machinery started to get more and more. And with the growing use of heavy machinery, there were many systems of levees put into place to hold back rivers and dams, and to keep the rivers from overrunning their banks. So a lot of drainage projects started happening, and in the low-lying lands that had previously been forest, they had been left bare by the timber industry. So because of this, many farmers in the area really trusted everything that was happening and got excited and started to plant their crops on these low-rise lands, and they started to plant their crops. In the 1920s, people had a buy now, pay later sort of mindset. So they took out many loans because the economy was booming at this point. So they took out loans, and they started to plant crops all over, and everything was going great because the ground was so fertile because of the the rainfall that they've had previously. So everything was looking great for the farmers. They have new crops and everything, but however, in the spring of 1927, the warm weather started to come, and early snow started melting Canada. So that caused the Mississippi River to swell. And in the Midwest, it started to rain a lot. So that caused the Mississippi River, that was already overflowing, to flow even more. And it did not stop raining. As the river is overflowing, the levees that were all put in place could not hold all the water, and they eventually burst. It is said in the 1927 National Geographic said that the streets of Arkansas were dry and dusty at noon, and then by 2 p.m., mules were drowning on Main Street faster than people could unhitch them from their wagons. So this shows how fast this all came. It was very sudden. No one could have really been prepared for this. Water poured so fast, homes and stores started to be ruined. There were dead animals floating in the water everywhere. The farmland was covered with sand, coated in mud, and it was just all washed away. All these new crops that the farmers had been working on. In response to the tragedy that was happening in Arkansas, the American Red Cross and many other volunteers from all around the United States came to Arkansas to try to relieve some of the damage that has been done. They set up army cots and tents everywhere, and they had refugee camps for people who needed it. Because the water went so high, it was destroying people's homes. There were helicopters and planes that were flying overhead to find people that were stuck on their roofs, and to try to help them. There was one refugee camp that carried more than 15,000 of the homeless people, but slowly more survivors started to come for help to these camps, and they just couldn't keep up with the amount of people that were coming with no dry clothing, no food, no water. They were cold, sick, and hungry, and they just couldn't keep up. And the segregated tents cities that were on the high ground couldn't keep up and could barely hold them. And then disease went rampage in all of the camps. With the water from the flood not being able to go anywhere, it just stayed there stagnant. This caused a breeding ground for mosquitoes in the area. So mosquitoes went around carrying malaria and typhoid all throughout these camps that were already infested with smallpox, many other diseases, just from being in such close quarters with one another. There also was an extent of pellagra. It was a vitamin deficiency disease that was brought from the lack of protein that these people had. So the death toll from all of the states that were affected by this flood was actually placed at 246 by the Red Cross, but the number of people without food, water, clothing, or work were numbered to 750,000 people. The flood did have a lot of other effects other than the physical effects on the land. It also brought racial and socioeconomic effects to the people that were living in Arkansas at the time. And this came from out-of-state workers and health officials fighting and arguing over who was going to get what type of aid and how it was going to be delivered to them. And this came mostly from arguments from big planters and big plantation owners. So in some parts, individuals would receive aid personally, their food and everything, but in other parts, due to the complaining that was happening by these planters, they would give all of the supplies to the big planters, and then they were in charge of passing it out among their sharecroppers or their workers on their fields. So sharecroppers are both black and white people who were typically impoverished or in debt, and they were the people who worked the fields for these big planters. So the planters were afraid that the sharecroppers might not come back to the farm after they go to the Red Cross camps, so they were afraid they wouldn't return home. So all of this led to a controversial mandate which stated that sharecroppers or particularly black sharecroppers, were admitted and released to the camps with supervision of their planters. African Americans needed a pass to enter or leave the camps. Some African Americans actually were forced at gunpoint by law enforcement to work on the levees and work in other flood relief efforts. And they also had to live by their work in makeshift tents. So many times the floods would be rising and rescue boats would leave empty. Now, the flood in the South took place in the Roaring 20s when the rest of the United States was thriving and they had prosperity. In Washington, D.C., the federal response under President Calvin Coolidge to the misery that people in Arkansas and the states surrounding his response was simply not $1 of federal money will be sent to the flood victims. So they just had to work it out for themselves. Through modern day communication such as the radio, it actually drew a national attention to the plight of sharecroppers. And it spurred a mass migration of black sharecroppers who were just tired of farming and tired of poverty and debt. So thousands of sharecroppers actually left plantations as soon as they could and headed north to look for jobs. So it really did change the plantation system. Thank you for letting me share my knowledge with you about the flood of 1927 in Arkansas. It was something that truly shaped Arkansas and really had an impact on the rest of the nation. So thank you for letting me share that with you. I'll see you later. Bye.